garlic chive.
qualities,
I
but it's
sell 'em,
essentially
like
a
15 for
flower-
$3.
A flower
Okay.
bush.
Okay.
I would like to
So
see if
15
the
of these,
properties
right?
were
Yeah.
expendable. It is just a plant that comes up around
And
here
that's
that we
through the
actually try
farmer's
to
market,
discourage.
or that's through
Yeah, the Red Hills.
Yeah. Yes.
And that's why it's called the 4 o'clock.
There you go. There are
Do
a
they
couple other ones on the
reproduce,
other side that
or
are blooming.
Yeah, they
It's not a
keep
particular
spreading
plant.
out.
So what part of them do you cut? That,
Yeah, I just cut it at ground level, and they resprout.
Oh, okay.
We've got
Yeah,
some
they're
pinks
perennial.
and yellows, but
And there's some there, and there's some there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
no, that's the other thing.
They're very short lived.
Yeah, I like to choose plants that have like a longer flowering or a longer fruiting season, and so this plant comes up, in a lot of places, and so when it does, we try to discourage it because it'll really get bushy and kind of get in the way. So behind us, I wanted to show you all. Before we put this landscape fabric down for this season, in the fall time, there was no fabric. We did rows actually oriented. Push the lizard. Our rows were oriented this way throughout the whole space. They were short but many rows, and incorporating this fabric, I actually wanted to switch the orientation, not only because I can get away with it with my sunlight needs, but that would allow me to have less cuts on this particular fabric and incorporate more growing space and move forward into that area, which I'm really happy with.
And this is a cover crop.
Yes. So
This
in
is,
between,
turnips,
we've done this.
kale, oats. These are oats.
Wheat. You'll see it's
Wheat.
just going to seed. And so I wanted to keep, we back this down in our usual systems, but I wanted to keep this area to show you guys this whole area after my fall
You can
harvest.
sell cover crops.
We put in a cover crop of a blend. I think, where did we get this from? Native
That's your cover
Nutritionist
crop?
or
This is a deer
deer cover.
mixture,
Wow.
So we got
and
this
it has
from-
turnips in it.
And look, this one's a radish.
Deer doesn't like it?
Deer love this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's for a deer plot, but it's great cover crop mix.
Yes.
Wow.
So this whole area had this cover crop. Of course, we ended up chopping it down to put this fabric on to continue to grow. But I left this strip here to see how things would play out in terms of it going to seed, continuing to add better soil. There's all kinds of things in here that Henry was mentioning. You're taking out more purple tops. This is the
So, Bergen, I have a question. So,
daikon radish. Yes.
So, from a design standpoint,
Mhm.
so the city lots are how much? She said 80 by 80. Yeah. So then, is this a 25-foot? Being able to know how to scale based on your size.
Yeah.
If you're looking at this yard and you've got fruit trees and things like that, which is different because this is more of a permanent area.
Yeah.
But in there, what would be the maximum length, for example, and how to look at what is the best way to maximize what your plot is. So these are 25, maybe something around
It's
there.
like 25 by
These
50,
are about,
probably 30 by
probably
50.
30 they're larger than 25. Our
We used to
intention
have the
is to push it-
rows going this way,
Yeah, stop
and so
saying.
we moved them going that way to make the rows longer.
So to maximize, I would definitely,
So from like a production standpoint,
Yeah.
so if you're going to sell
Yeah.
25,
I would say minimum 25.
yeah.
Of
So then
course,
if
you're constrained by your
but for
area.
your own family, when you're starting out,
Yeah.
and you're not going to share, what should be the maximum?
Oh,
Depends on how much vegetables your family eats, because we do consultations and installations. And I make this huge garden for a family, and they're like, "We can't eat this much lettuce," and I was like, "I could
That's
eat
the
this much
point.
lettuce,"
Right,
you know.
right.
Yeah.
So that's
it's
kind
that
of relative
scale of
too.
size.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And based on like the plants and things, obviously, but we've been talking about this about how fast, and you made a comment about okra.
Yeah.
And squash is like this too. You can literally pick morning, noon, and night. No joke. Especially
Right.
okra. They're
Yeah.
crazy. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, especially
And-
with the rains and the sun.
So then you have to take that in consideration as opposed to like the celery, which is going to take a long harvest within the crop design, right? So
Yes.
if you are growing just for your family, the question is, what do you want to eat? What are your needs?
Yes.
And how much do you need on a daily basis? What would you?
And what's
right?
its shelf life too?
What's the shelf life? What would you put for my daily edible? I know that grows quickly based on the season, and then maybe the other part would be for the longer, slower growing. I don't know. That's just that's
Yes.
a question as far as
I'm
design.
glad you brought that up. So when I think of those systems, I think of them, or in permaculture, we think of them in zones. right? So our zone 0, it's a concentric, or it doesn't have to be concentric. It is just based on how things are in your
Circles
space.
within circles.
Yes.
Yeah.
So zone 0, of course, is home and people. And so what systems are in there, how they incorporate food comes into that space, waste comes out of it, right? And so how does that incorporate into zone 1? Zone 1 is this area, is our annual crops, maybe even our chickens if we're collecting eggs, things like that. Moving into our zone 2, those are our perennial areas, right? Those are our crops that continue to produce food, but are not, but they are not intense, or they are not frequently visited in the system, right? And so that area, I would probably choose things like sweet potatoes, stuff like that doesn't need as much maintenance, but also could be on an edge of a space. So not necessarily in your annual growing space that you are actively, producing in. We could use edges too, right? And so you don't have to limit yourself to, here's my square, this is the only growing area I can use, it's my one square. There are edges, there are so many areas that we can continue to produce in. And then moving through the zones, we go into zones 4 and 5, which are if you have other types of livestock, orchards, maybe it's your structures like a barn or storage, or and then you're going into your zone 5, which is wildlife, unmanaged, forested areas, right? And so in those areas, there's a lot of resources. We've got leaf fall, leaf litter, forage opportunities, right? There's still food happening in those wildlife areas. Those can still be inputs into our zones 1 and 2, right? So
you could do a multi-level.
Yes.
So like I love your system there for the trellis, but going back to the Three Sisters, if you have a small lot, so not only is it going to help with the pest management, weed management, now in almost the same space, you're getting 2 or 3 crops in a very small space.
Exactly, and so we're using those niches of vertical, horizontal, and then in-ground. Absolutely. Yeah, so these are, I think, our safari zucchini. So you'll notice that I have a standardized, behind the fence we have a standardized plywood, what do you call it? Our template. No, sorry with a T. So we have our template, right? And it's a size of a piece of plywood, and we have 3 rows. They're about 8 to 10 inches apart for each row. You'll notice that is not a good spacing for certain plants, like, this. So in this system, we do skip pulls, we're doing companion planting. The reason why I had it standardized is that I would like to get more use out of this in coming into the fall season and the winter season, where I can put every single hole can have collard greens or broccoli or whatever the case is. And so this particular system, instead of changing it or getting new stuff, I did as dense as possible for the season that works best for us, which is actually fall and winter. And so that's the reason why this particular system looks like this.
You can make your own home.
Yes, and so with our with my little handy flame torch, my new favorite tool, Hamid does a great job. He likes doing it too. We remove this from the garden space. We do not burn plastic into our garden area. We do it over in the concrete. We put a barrier in between the concrete. Sometimes it's cardboard, and then we put our landscape fabric on top. On top of that will be our template, which is a plywood, and so our burning is concentrated into those holes. We use a skill saw.
Wow, what is that?
Yes.
This is what happens when you don't pick them every other day.
Yes, and so another issue is like you can't even see them, right? So we got to go in there.
Continue to grow.
And so we have a summer squash in here, but also winter squash, or a long season squash. And so right here, I have not only my butternuts, but I have my Seminole pumpkins. And I know, because I know the growth pattern of this plant.
Is that cucumber?
Yeah. No, these are all zucchini. So I know the growth pattern for Seminole pumpkins, right? And so they're gonna move out into a space. And so my intention is that these are on an edge, and they're gonna move into my food forest system as an understory crop. And so this area, we're gonna weed whack it. We've got some sunflowers coming up behind you. But all of these Seminole squash will occupy this space under my food forest, and they will go essentially to the street, right? And so they produce a significant amount. So they're going to keep.
So it's not going to go the other way?
No, well, I'm going to train them to go this way. They're also on this edge.
Do you need it every day?
Yeah.
U-turn.
So they're on this edge. You see they're already making their way over. Right over here. I know it's already popping out of the ground. So I mainly just So I mainly just train them in terms of staying out of their way. And this area we're going to work a little bit in today. We're going to mulch it, and this will just continue to go across. Yes. If it's starting to go this way, then we will just gently move it. If they're not, some of them will root into the ground, but if they're not super
Black eyes, rooting into the ground.
if I had like some kind of trellising, perhaps I'll go around it. Seminole squash is fine on the ground. They'll go across. Mulch is going to help us even more because that'll keep our humidity down. The one thing about certain squashes, especially pumpkins, if they're in a food forest system, they're not getting as much sunlight. What helps is putting a mulch barrier down, just so so things stay drier. You know, having weeds come up and touching them might promote powdery mildew, which is a big problem. But again, Seminole pumpkins do really, really well in this area, and so we're really happy with them as a ground cover, a food that is long lasting, and then we get to occupy this understory, right? Because a part of this food forest system is that we can create food in different niches, right? So this, great ground cover, covering up my weeds. We've got some food. You know, they can even go up into the trees as a vining tree plant, right? So I have this long summer squash. Henry's picking all the zucchini. These are our zucchini plants right here. So these are a relatively shorter lived crops. So once the super heat comes in, bugs are going to come in. These crops right here in particular, we're going to go ahead and remove. And these Seminole pumpkin, they'll hang out until probably October, depending on how the season goes, right? And so this area is designed to move into that space, right? We also have right on this edge here, looks a little different in terms of its leaf size and space. These are butternuts. And so butternut squash, they're plant. They don't hang out as long as, of course, the Seminole pumpkin, but the actual squash themselves will hang out on the shelf for months and months, and they'll be fine. Wow. So that's our winter squash. They have a very hard. Another thing about walking through
Safari
this
squash.
is trying to not crush anything. But of course, we've got our butternuts. I don't know if you guys can see that, but they're coming up right in here. They're everywhere. They're green right now, but they'll continue to flesh out and turn pink.
The fabric's keeping them cleaner too.
We're happy with this fabric. Yeah, they're keeping them clean. They're keeping the bugs down. We do have issues with flea beetles.
And we're barely seeing any flea beetle damage here.
So we've been able to manage our pest problem without having to spray, of course, which is amazing. We do not want to spray. We're happy with this. Moving into the areas moving that way, this trellising is for cucumbers. You'll notice this block right here, hercules. My personal design was, I want to make sure that all of these plants are in a similar family because I want them to finish out relatively at the same time, but also I can block things out and manage. If these were all multiple plant families, it would just be a little more difficult in terms of my
Crop rotation.
Yeah, my crop rotation. It's just more mental legwork to make sure that the crop rotation's good. And so if it's blocked out well, then that rotation's good. I'm still companion planting in this area. I'd like to add, we not only are adding nasturtiums and herbs and parsleys and stuff to help with our spring our spring predators, spring pollinators, bringing them into the space. It just helps with pests as well. So,
I have a question.
yes.
Suppose you don't want these to continue to grow all the way to the street.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you can do?
If I don't want to deter that,
Yeah.
if I wanted to deter that, I would consider some kind of trellising system. And so if I didn't want them to go across the space, I would probably want them to go up.
Okay.
So whether that's a fence line, whether that's in the trees, literally in the trees, I could do that. Or if it's incorporating a panel just like this,
People do arbor,
yeah, arbors
so a
like
pumpkin can grow over
Yeah.
the whole arbor.
Okay.
this. Yeah.
Okay.
So
Or
perhaps
you have a
I would
pumpkin
do
tunnel, and
an
the
arbor
pumpkin's
like this,
hanging down.
Okay.
which we did consider,
Thank you.
but of
Yeah.
course that is
And then-
investment.
These are all the meristems.
Yes.
A meristem
This
is a
just-
point of
this
new
is a
growth,
Okay.
hybridized version.
and so you can trim
The
them.
pumpkin's going into a food
Oh,
forest. That's
and they won't
more
grow as
our
long, but they'll get
design
bushier.
elements that we're
Okay.
incorporating.